What if I told you there was a hidden gold mine in Arizona? One that, if located, would turn you into an instant billionaire. There's just one catch. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people have already gone in search of it, several dozen of whom were never seen again. At least not alive. Thus is the legend of the lost Dutchman's mine, a fabled motherlode hidden somewhere in Arizona's Superstition Mountains. Mountains, by the way, that are allegedly protected by an ancient Apache curse. Oh my. But how true are these stories? Is there any evidence that the lost Dutchman mine ever even existed? What about the Peralta stones? Are those real or just an elaborate hoax? And what's up with all of the people who have been found decapitated right there in the Superstition Mountains? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. The Lost Dutchman mine was originally named after German immigrant Jacob Waltz. He first arrived in Arizona in the early 1860s, and by 1870, he was homesteading near Phoenix, about 60 or so miles west of the Superstition Mountains. More on him in just a few minutes, but first, I do think it's important to establish a backstory. As it turns out, the legend of the Lost Dutchman mine goes way back, long before Jacob Waltz was even so much as a twinkle in his daddy's eyes, even before the founding of the United States. You see, way back in the year 1750, a Spanish family, known as the Peraltas, were granted a huge chunk of land from the King of Spain, over 3,700 square miles along Arizona's Gila River, including the Superstition Mountains. When Patriarch Miguel Sr. passed away in 1788, the land went to his son, Miguel II, who prospected the area with his own sons, Pedro, Ramon, and Manuel. Full disclosure, but there are no official records to support these claims. In fact, historians can't even say for certain if the Peralta family truly existed. The only thing we know for sure is that there was a Pedro de Peralta who served as the governor of New Mexico in the early 17th century. Everything else is essentially folklore, rumors, and anecdotal stories just passed down from one generation to the next. I just wanted to point that out because what I'm about to tell you, specifically in regard to the Peralta family, is a tad bit on the dubious side, okay? In other words, there is no real evidence to back any of it up. But still, the Peraltas are a very integral part of the legend, so it is worth sharing. So, with all that in mind, per the legend, the Peraltas began digging for gold there in the Superstition Mountains at some point in the early 1800s. And by the year 1845, they had hit the mother lode, a golden goose that Don Miguel christened the Sombrero Mine, on account of a nearby peak resembling a sombrero. That peak, by the way, is now known as Weaver's Needle. But yeah, like I said, the Peraltas hit pay dirt. A vein of ore so rich with gold that if it were to be located nowadays, it's estimated to be worth billions, if not trillions of dollars. The only problem was the land they were mining was smack dab in the middle of Apache territory. And this is at a time when Apache raids were becoming much more frequent. But be that as it may, the Peraltas didn't really have any issues with the indigenous. The Apaches were certainly aware of their presence, but they didn't consider them to be a threat, at least not at first. Now, in the months that followed, the Peraltas established a total of 8 mines there in the mountains. As such, it didn't take too long for them to collect a good amount of ore, and eventually they decided to haul some of it down to Mexico for a much-needed vacation. Per Este Conister in her book The Sterling Legend, quote, "In preparation for their journey, they discovered they had accumulated much more gold than they could possibly transport in a single trip. After giving the matter considerable thought, they selected what they believed to be a safe place and cached the surplus gold with intentions of retrieving it on their next trip. To make sure that the location of all the mines would be known to all 3 of them, Pedro drew 3 maps showing the location of each of the 8 mines. Keeping one for himself, he gave the other 2 to Manuel and Ramon." End of quote. And yeah, the trip went off without a hitch. The brothers arrived in Mexico safe and sound, and were even able to secure a buyer for the gold. And like I said, they even stuck around for a while to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Leastways they did until they heard of the impending invasion of American troops, a little dust-up known as the Mexican-American War. And naturally, not wanting their treasure to fall into the hands of the gringos, brothers Ramon and Pedro rushed north to secure as much of the gold as possible. To once more quote Mrs. Conister, "Thus a few weeks later, the final expedition was underway. There were almost 100 men and twice as many pack animals. It was indeed a sight to behold, and upon reaching the Superstition area, it was a sight that did not please the Apaches. To them, such a large number of white men could only mean one thing: trouble. But in their usual manner, they bided their time and waited until everything was in their favor before making their move. End of quote. And yeah, you know what happens next, right? It was a total bloodbath. The Apaches not only killed Pedro and Ramon Peralta, but they also massacred their hired hands. Allegedly. There are some versions of the story claiming that one or two survivors did make it back to Mexico, but that they were either unwilling or unable to return to the mines. Now, after the war, there were a ton of American settlers flocking to Arizona territory, two of whom were prospectors Aloysius Hurley and Sean O'Connor. The adventurous duo began exploring the Superstition Mountains in the early 1850s, and as fate would have it, they stumbled upon the remains of a dead burro, possibly one of the Peralta pack animals killed by the Apache. What's more, buried in the ground nearby was a rotted-out pack saddle filled to the brim with gold concentrate. Now, whether or not Hurley and O'Connor were aware of the Peralta massacre is unknown, but I guess they figured where there's one dead donkey carrying gold, there might be more dead donkeys carrying gold. A philosophy that I personally try to live my life by. So they continued searching, and sure enough, they did locate another pack saddle full of gold concentrate. At this point, the lucky prospectors had a three-pronged mission. First, they had to extract the gold from the ore, as the deposits were just too heavy to carry out between the two of them. And then they had to get it smelted, and then finally, number 3, they had to locate a buyer. All this without arousing too much suspicion. And on that front, they were successful. They made it all the way to San Francisco, where they sold the gold to the U.S. Mint for $37,000, or around $1.5 million in today's money. Now keep in mind that we are still discussing the legend. Hurley and O'Connor aren't always included in the various stories, but it does at least somewhat help to explain what happened to the gold from the Peralta massacre, if it even actually occurred. Either way, the mine, or mines, would continue to remain a secret until the arrival of the guy I mentioned earlier, the Dutchman himself, Jacob Waltz. And just to be clear, Waltz was a German immigrant from Prussia, okay, not the Netherlands. Not sure if this is common in other countries, but historically here in the United States, Germans have been labeled Dutch, mostly due to confusion over the German word Deutsch, not to be confused with the very American word douche. As far as Waltz goes, he first arrived here in America in the late 1830s. He initially settled in St. Louis, but would eventually head west to California. You could actually find him there on the 1860 federal census, living in sunny Los Angeles and employed as a miner. Not long thereafter, he migrated to Arizona, where he continued to prospect. In fact, he even filed on 3 separate claims up in Yavapai County. Didn't strike it rich, though. Instead, he did like most of the other prospectors and worked as a laborer for other, more successful miners. Guys like fellow Prussian Henry Wickenburg. If you're not familiar, it was Wickenburg who discovered the extremely lucrative Vulture mine, about 70 or so miles northwest of Phoenix. Speaking of Phoenix, a guy by the name of Jake Willing took a large group of men down to the Salt River in 1867 to help dig an irrigation canal, which is basically how the town of Phoenix, Arizona came to be. And while we can't prove for a fact that Waltz was one of the laborers who helped dig the canal, we do know that he began homesteading near Phoenix around that same period, putting him all that much closer to the fabled Superstition Mountains. Now, as to how Waltz actually discovered the mine, once again, nobody can say for sure, but there are 3 main stories. One is that his Apache girlfriend told him about the gold and even guided him straight to it, only to later on have her tongue cut out by her fellow Apaches for betrayal. The other story is that Waltz and fellow prospector Jacob Weisner simply stumbled upon the mine out of pure dumb luck. Luck. That's not a word. Luck is the word I'm looking for. Pure dumb luck. And finally, there is a story claiming that Waltz learned about the mine from none other than Miguel Peralta himself. In fact, according to an article published in a Prescott newspaper shortly after Waltz's death, Don Miguel even drew him a map. Per Robert Sikorsky in his book Fool's Gold, quote, armed with a map and verbal accounts, Waltz journeyed to Tucson, where he revealed his secret to Jacob Weiser, countryman whom he persuaded to join in the search for the Peralta properties. Eventually, Waltz and Weiser reached the south side of the Superstition Mountains and proceeded up the first long draw leading to the interior, as per instructions written on the map. They soon found the trail, which led over the top of the main mountain and down a long ridge, past Sombrero Butte, into a deep, brush-covered canyon. From there, the trail meandered through a small boulder-strewn arroyo. I always struggle with that word, arroyo, eventually terminating at the diggings. Now, the next part is a little crazy, but just as soon as they arrived there at the mine, they heard someone breaking rock. Upon closer inspection, they saw what appeared to be 3 Apache warriors pounding and sorting ore. So they immediately opened fire and killed all 3 of them. Here's the catch, though. They weren't really Apaches. They were former employees of Miguel Peralta, who had slipped away from his ranch to do a little prospecting of their own. As I'm sure you can imagine, Waltz and Weiser were more than a little nervous after just murdering 3 people, so they quickly gathered up as much gold as they could carry and began making their way back down the mountain. That's when the real Apaches showed up, and brother, they were not happy. In the chaos that ensued, the prospectors became separated. Waltz eventually made his way back to Phoenix unscathed, as a mortally wounded Weiser sought refuge with a friendly band of Pima. He'd linger for about a week before eventually succumbing to his wounds. Once again, per Robert Sikorsky, quote, "At the same time, Judge John D. Walker, owner of the famous Veckel mine, was living with the Pimas at one of their villages about 18 miles west of the present town of Florence. Weiser, after 3 days of torturous travel, staggered into his camp, weak and exhausted. Walker did what he could to relieve his pain, but at the end of a week, the German contracted a fever and died. While still rational, he told Judge Walker about his adventure and gave him the gold he managed to salvage. Walker was evidently busy with other matters at the time, for he failed to investigate the story, although Weiser gave him full directions on how to find the monumented trail to the mine." End of quote. Now, years later, Walker would share his story with a newspaper out of Florence, and it was supposedly corroborated by Waltz himself. But then again, there are other stories claiming that it was Waltz who killed Weiser, or Weisner as he's sometimes referred to, just in order to keep all the gold for himself. Other versions claim that he left Weiser alone in the mountains, and that's when the man was murdered. Whatever the case, Jacob Waltz would eventually return to the superstitions. And according to S.D. Conister, from this point on, most variations of the legend seem to coincide, and for all practical purposes, tell the same story. For the next decade or so, Waltz rarely went to the mine, but each time he did, he would return with gold. It was these trips that fostered the portion of the legend that is so well known today and tells of how the Dutchman, cleverly evading all who attempted to follow, would disappear into the mountains and reappear in Phoenix, scant few days later with a burro laden with gold, or so rich that it could be shipped directly to the mint without processing. Now, that may all be true, but I do think it's worth noting that Waltz did not lead an extravagant lifestyle. There were no lavish mansions or fancy carriages or anything like that. He kept on living pretty much the same as he had before. I think he built an adobe there on his homestead, but that's about it. In fact, in 1878, he did something that you wouldn't really expect from someone that was swimming in money. He sold all of his property and everything on it to his neighbor, Andrew Starr, for just $50 in cash. 50, along with the guarantee that Starr would look after Waltz for the rest of his life. Sounds a little weird, but you gotta think. Waltz would have been pushing 70 years of age at this point. He would live for another 13 years, so it's not like he was at death's door or anything, but all that time prospecting had likely taken its toll. He wasn't able to really tend to his own property anymore, much less make arduous trips to the mountains, so I guess this is just his way of securing a little help. Besides, it's not like he had a wife or kids to look after him in his old age. That said, it wasn't until Waltz's death in October of 1891 that the madness surrounding the mine really began in earnest, mostly due to 50 pounds of gold being located in a secret stash under his bed. Ooh, the plot thickens. Once again, allegedly. Okay, that should be the subtitle to this entire episode. Allegedly. Story goes that a guy named Richard J. Holmes was present at the time of Waltz's death, and Waltz gave him the box of gold, along with directions to the mine, just moments before passing away. Is this true? I have no idea, but I do know that word soon began to spread, and the rumors alone were enough to convince people that the mine did exist. By the way, it was originally called Dutch Jacob's Mine. It wasn't until years later that the Lost Dutchman name was finally coined. As far as the location goes, Waltz was also said to have shared his secret with a lady who nursed him during his final months, Julia Thomas. And much like with Holmes, he even drew her a map. According to a newspaper out of Tucson, less than a year after Waltz's death, quote, "Mrs. Thomas, formerly of the Thomas Ice Cream Parlors, is now in the Superstition Mountains engaged in work usually deemed strange to the women's sphere. She is prospecting for a lost mine, the location of which she believes she holds the key. But somehow she has failed after 2 months' work to locate the bonanza, though aided by 2 men. The story of the mine is founded upon the usual deathbed revelations of the ancient miner, usual in such cases. There is also a lost cabin connected with it. The location is supposed to be a short distance back from the western end of the main Superstition Mountains. End of quote. Now, those 2 men that Julia Thomas partnered with were brothers Reinhardt and Herman Petrasch. Reinhardt was actually a resident of Phoenix and one of Julia's hired hands. He was also a companion of Jacob Waltz during his final days. As such, he was also present for the prospector's final moments when he shared the location of the treasure. His brother Herman was brought in after the fact. The trio left Phoenix in August 1892 and headed straight for Weaver's Needle. They made camp in Needle Canyon for 3 weeks, but, as I alluded to a moment ago, despite their best efforts, they just could not locate Waltz's mysterious mine. Eventually, they had to return to Phoenix after running out of provisions. For Thomas, the entire trip was a financial disaster. She wasn't a rich woman to begin with, and what little money she had went to funding the expedition. And after failing to discover the gold, she abandoned it altogether and got married. That said, she was still able to turn a profit by selling treasure maps. Whether or not those maps were accurate, I will let you decide. Now, remember what I said about word spreading. Indeed, in the months immediately following Jacob's death, the story of the lost mine proved very popular, as people from all over the country rushed to the mountains looking to try their luck. Then, in November of 1894, just to further stir the public's imagination, Julia Thomas released the very first public directions to the mine. Quote, "In a gulch in the Superstition Mountains, the location of which is described by certain landmarks, there is a 2-room house in the mouth of a cave on the side of a slope near the gulch. Just across the gulch, about 200 yards opposite this house in the cave, is a tunnel, well covered up and concealed in the bushes. Here is the mine, the richest in the world according to Dutch Jacob. Some distance above the tunnel, on the side of the mountain, is a shaft or incline that is not so steep, but one can climb down. This, too, is covered carefully. The shaft goes right down in the midst of the rich gold ledge, where it can be picked off in flakes of almost pure gold." Now, as you may have noticed, the directions provided by Miss Thomas tell you what to do when you reach the gulch, but not how to get there. It wasn't until many years later that a full guide was eventually published, but just like with every other aspect of the story, the directions changed with each new rendition. By the way, that stone house that she mentioned in the mouth of the cave, it was allegedly located by a journalist/adventurer named Pierpont Bicknell around the turn of the century. But even then, Bicknell failed to locate the hidden mine. Still though, with the location of the cabin now public knowledge, allegedly, it was only a matter of time until someone found the gold, right? Wrong. To this day, the lost Dutchman mine has still not been located. Or if it has, whoever found it's pretty damn good at keeping secrets. Now, if there was an army doctor stationed in nearby Fort McDowell, a guy by the name of Abraham Thorne, who treated an Apache for an eye disease. And as a show of gratitude, the warrior blindfolded Thorne, brought him inside one of his hidden mines, and told him to take as much gold as he could carry. And yeah, okay, maybe. I don't know about you, but I'm not letting anybody blindfold me and take me to a cave in the mountains, unless they have a very large and succulent booty. But the reason I bring this story up is due to speculation that Waltz and Thorne's mines were one and the same, especially if you consider the Apache connection. It's also worth noting that there have been other gold mines discovered in the general vicinity, any of which could possibly be the fabled Lost Dutchman's mine. Who knows, maybe Waltz was just really bad when it came to giving directions. Now, during the early 20th century, the popularity of the mine did begin to plummet. Every now and then, you'd get an excited treasure hunter who thought he held the one and true map, but nothing ever really came of it. It wasn't until the 1931 death of adventurer Adolph Ruth that the Lost Dutchman's mine once again started making headlines. Story goes that Ruth had obtained a map from someone who claimed to have gotten it from the Peraltas, and thus provisioned, he set out to the mountains alone, looking to strike it rich. Only problem was, Mr. Ruth was pushing 70 years of age with a bad hip. What's more, it was in the dead of summer. Unsurprisingly, he was never heard from again. His skull was eventually discovered several months later, but it'd be a few weeks after that until the rest of his body was found, supposedly near Blacktop Mesa. The sheriff's office investigated, and according to them, Ruth died of natural causes, and the animal simply carried the skull away from the body. And okay, fine, I do think that's believable, But a different story soon began to circulate alleging that Ruth had been shot in the head and decapitated. To add further intrigue, investigators also found Ruth's notebook. In it, the treasure hunter claimed to not only have found the mine, but even scribbled down the directions. He ended his entry with the triumphant words, Veni, Vidi, Vici. Or for those of you who don't think about the Roman Empire all that often, I came, I saw, I conquered. By the way, the idea that Adolf Ruth was shot in the head, rather than dying of thirst or starvation or even a heart attack, comes from just one unverified coroner's report, a document that, to the best of my knowledge, nobody else has been able to corroborate. Shady evidence aside, I'm sure you can guess which of the stories the press decided to run with. Rather than go with the admittedly boring tale of an old man succumbing to the elements, they decided to print the sensational claims that Ruth had been murdered and decapitated, all while in search of a lost gold mine. Another twist came a couple of decades later when a vacationing couple found a series of strange stone tablets. 4 in total, one of which was shaped like a heart and inscribed with what appeared to be directions. There were even names like Pedro and Manuel carved into the stones, leading many to conclude that they were references to the Peraltas and their lost mine. So yeah, with all these new developments, it was only a matter of time until the lost Dutchman's mine experienced a revival. The public was not only intrigued, but wasn't long before folks once again began flocking to the mountains, in droves, looking to solve the mystery. Sadly, more than a few of them have suffered the same fate as Adolf Ruth. I was unable to find an exact number, but it's thought that at least 30 people have perished while actively searching for the treasure. And that's not including all the people who just happen to be in the mountain for other purposes, like camping or hiking. And yeah, some of these people were also allegedly decapitated. In fact, in 1960, there was a headless skeleton discovered near the foot of a cliff, right there in the Superstition Mountains. And within the next month, 2 additional bodies were found nearby, causes of death unknown. As far as I'm aware, they still had their heads. In 1961, a family picnicking near the edge of the mountains discovered a body buried beneath the sand. The victim, later determined to be Charles Boheen, had been shot in the back. A couple months after that, a prospector named Walter Mowry was found dead in Needle Canyon. Despite his body being riddled with bullets, his death was ruled a suicide. 5 days later, a painter from San Francisco, William Harvey, was also found dead. Cause of death undetermined. 1963, a guy by the name of Vance Bacon fell to his death after allegedly being fired upon. And he was not the only person who supposedly got sniped at in that same area. And I could go on and on, man. 1964, brothers Richard and Robert Cremus found dead at the bottom of a high cliff. That same year, the headless body of Jay Clapp was discovered. That's right, yet another decapitation. Apparently Clapp had gone missing 3 years prior. 1970, seasoned prospector Al Morrow killed by a falling boulder. 1973, man was shot dead at his campsite. 1976, 2 more prospectors were found dead of gunshot wounds. 1978, Manuel Valdez found murdered. 1980, another skeleton discovered, later identified as Rick Finning. 1984, prospector Walt Gassler, who devoted much of his life to looking for the mine, was found dead with gold in his backpack, almost identical to the rich ore that Jacob Waltz had sold a century prior. And like I said, these are just a few of the examples. Even as recently as 2009, a 35-year-old from Denver disappeared while searching for the mine. His remains weren't identified until 2013. Same thing happened to 3 hikers from Utah in 2010. Hell, just last year, in 2024, a guy went on a day hike there in the Superstition Mountains, and he never returned. So yeah, I'd say there does appear to be something fishy going on, at least at first glance. But then again, devil's advocate, a ton of people do visit the Superstition Mountains each and every year, and the vast majority of them come out just fine. In fact, here in the United States, over 300 million people visit national parks annually. And out of all those people in all of the national parks combined, only a little over 1,000 go missing. And most of those 1,000 are located safe and sound. They just get turned around on hiking trails or overheated or whatever. So I don't know, man. Yes, people have gone missing and even died in the Superstition Mountains under what appear to be mysterious circumstances. But I do think at some point we've got to take Occam's razor into account, or the idea that the simplest explanation is oftentimes the most plausible. Maybe I'm crazy. You tell me, which scenario do you find the most likely? That there's some supernatural curse or other deviant force protecting a mysterious gold mine that thus far has not even yet been proven to exist, or that a tiny percentage of people are just succumbing to the usual injuries that come with hiking in the mountains. And then, of course, you've got the psychological aspect. You got an area with a super cool yet creepy name like the Superstition Mountains, coupled with all the legends and tall tales, and you're naturally going to be a little hyper aware. All of a sudden, the sound of a squirrel scurrying up a tree is going to put you on edge. You're going to start seeing ancient Apache warriors behind every rock. So I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a skeptic, but while the Lost Dutchman mine seems very compelling on the surface, there really doesn't appear to be anything of substance there. And as tends to be the case, once you dig just a little deeper, the entire legend begins to unravel. I'll give you a for instance. I touched on this earlier, but there is zero evidence that the Peralta family even existed, at least in regards to owning a huge land grant or mining gold in the Superstition Mountains. Don't get me wrong, there was a Peralta mine in the mid-19th century. It was even owned by a guy named Manuel Peralta. Only thing is, it was located in California as opposed to Arizona. But here's the crazy part. When the California mine went belly up, Manuel Peralta became a swindler. He sold a fraudulent 3 million acre Spanish land grant to a Dr. George Willing down in Arizona. And this was in the late 1860s, mind you. So right around the same time that this entire legend was beginning to emerge. Although Willing figured out fairly quickly that he'd been conned, his partner James Rivas continued to assert that the fraudulent grant was indeed authentic, even after Willing passed away. There's a lot more involved, but before it was all said and done, Rivas was given a $5,000 fine and sentenced to 2 years in prison. I bring this up because there are a lot of people, myself included, who think that the very real story of Manuel Peralta and his fraudulent land grant was coupled with a few other stories, some of which may be true, others just tall tales, and over time, these stories have all got lumped together and they sort of morphed into the legend of the Lost Dutchman's mine. I'll give you another example. Remember the guy I mentioned earlier, the Army Dr. Thorne, who treated the Apache with the eye disease? Well, as it turns out, there are no records of a Dr. Thorne ever working for the Army. There was a real Dr. Thorne, and he did allegedly discover gold, just not in Arizona. The real doctor claimed to have found a rich vein over in New Mexico after being taken captive by the Navajo in the early 1850s. Later told some soldiers about the gold, they went looking, but returned empty-handed. Much like with Manuel Peralta and the California mine, I do think that Dr. Thorne's story over the years just kind of got absorbed into the Lost Dutchman's myth. I mean, you got to keep in mind that these stories were circulating long before Jacob Waltz ever stepped foot in the Superstition Mountains. As far as the Peralta stones are concerned, I don't have any proof one way or the other, but from just what little I know, they smack of a hoax. In fact, this entire story is giving me some serious Oak Island vibes. I'm actually kind of surprised that the History Channel doesn't have a crew up in the Superstition Mountains 24/7 just milking their viewers for all they're worth. Now, for the record, I am not the only skeptic out there, okay? The great author and Western historian Marshall Trimble is also not buying the hype, at least not anymore. In a 2019 edition of True West magazine, Mr. Trimble stated, quote, "The Lost Dutchman is one of the greatest lost mine stories of them all. I've spent years studying and writing about it, and even searching for it. And I don't believe Jacob Waltz had a fabulous gold mine in the Superstitions." Mr. Trimble then goes on to say that the bulk of the story seems to be embellished by the aforementioned Pierpont Bicknell. He's the guy I mentioned earlier who allegedly discovered that cabin in the mouth of the cave. I sort of glossed over Bicknell's involvement, but he really does seem to be the main author of the entire legend. Born in Syracuse, New York, around 1836, the highly educated Bickle first arrived in Arizona at some point in 1870. He started writing for the newspapers, as well as doing a little prospecting and treasure hunting on the side. He never had much luck locating any of these various lost mines, but he did make some pretty decent money writing about them. His stories proved extremely popular, and they were chock full of embellishments. And many of those embellishments have helped to launch the Lost Dutchman's mine to mythical proportions. Or, to once again quote Marshall Trimble, "With a great display of literary license and embellishment, Bicknell created the legend we are most familiar with today. He provided provocative clues to the whereabouts of the Dutchman's gold, and for the first time he used the phrase, Dutchman's lost gold, incorporating the weaver's needle into the tale. End of quote. Trimble even thinks it was Bignell who made up the story about the Peralta family being massacred by the Apaches. By the way, I did reach out to Mr. Trimble, mostly just to ask if any gold at all has ever been found in the Superstition Mountains. And he replied that yes, gold was found in the area. There were mines in the early 1900s, including the Mormon Girl and the Mammoth around Goldfield in the western area, and they are still mining in the far east side of the range. However, the legend of the mine focuses on Weaver's Needle, but geologically, there is no gold around there. These tales were told to steer treasure hunters away from the areas where gold could be found. The latest info I have on the Dutchman's mine is from my friend Jesse Feldman, who spent a lifetime searching the superstitions. According to Jesse in his book, The Dutchman's Trail, the mine did exist, but it was 10 miles east of Weaver's Needle in the vicinity of the Silver King mine. So there is gold in them thar hills, just not around Weaver's Needle. I already knew that because I searched for it in the 1960s before it became a wilderness area. Hope this helps. End of quote, and thank you, Mr. Marshall Trimble. Now you may be asking yourself, if there was no gold mine near Weaver's Needle, then where did Jacob Waltz get all that gold? Especially considering that he never filed on a claim anywhere in the Superstition Mountains. Well, if you'll recall, I mentioned how Waltz had previously been employed at Henry Wickenburg's Vulture mine. Apparently all that ore that was being transferred from the mine was very poorly supervised, and Wickenburg had a ton of issues with people stealing from him, a process known as high grading. I've even read sources alleging that as much as half of the ore that was pulled out of the Vulture mine was stolen. And there are some who think that Waltz got whatever gold he had by also stealing from Mr. Wickenburg. Now, full disclosure, there is no real evidence. Once again, there's that word again, evidence. There's no real evidence other than hearsay that Jacob Waltz even worked for Henry Wickenburg. That too is purely apocryphal, like pretty much every other detail in today's story. However, that doesn't necessarily rule out the Venture mine. After all, Waltz could have simply been the middleman, sort of a fence, who paired up the thieves with their buyers. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on the Lost Dutchman's mine. It's my opinion that is just a combination of many different events that were told, tall tales and legends that were told over and over and over again, and they just all got lumped into one story of the Lost Dutchman's mine. I think probably Waltz did have some gold. Maybe he stole it from somebody else. Maybe he got it from one of his older mines. I don't know, but yeah, I'm going to say this one is probably busted. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the Lost Dutchman mine most likely does not exist. Okay, so don't you and your buddies get all liquored up and go out there looking for it and blame me when you break your leg. But what do you think? Am I an idiot? Is there more to the story than meets the eye? Did I leave out any important information? Or am I being bought off by big gold? You didn't think of that, did you? Get accused of that all the time when I discuss Brushy Bill Roberts. Do you think the mine really existed? Do you think it ever existed? Do you think it still exists to this day? Hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com or drop a comment down below because I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Before you go, just real quick, I do have an announcement. You may remember me making a few minor changes earlier this year. I got rid of the merchandise, I got rid of the paid tier for the newsletter, and I also discontinued Buy Me a Coffee. And all of this was just done to simplify things, and for the most part, turned out to be the right decision. However, I still have a ton of listeners contacting me, asking how they can best support the Wild West Extravaganza financially. First of all, the best thing that anybody can do to support the show is completely free, and that's just by spreading the word. Email your favorite episodes to friends, post links on social media, tell your coworkers, stuff like that. And like I said, that is totally free to do. As far as the money goes, I do have the Wild West Extravaganza Patreon. That would probably be the best bet for contributing financially, but not everyone is a huge fan of the reoccurring monthly charges. They want to give back to the show, but not necessarily every month, which I totally understand. The only thing is, without the Buy Me a Coffee option, they have no way of doing so. That being the case, I have decided to go ahead and bring it back. Same link as before, or you can just go there at buymeacoffee.com/Wild West. By the way, if you're a new listener or maybe you're just not familiar with Buy Me a Coffee, it's essentially just a way to send tips online. Sort of like if you see someone in public playing guitar, you walk by and you drop $1 in their hat. Same thing, only with Buy Me a Coffee, it's digital. All you gotta do is go to buymeacoffee.com/Wild West, choose how many coffees you want to buy, and hit send. Easy peasy. You can use the link down below, or you can head over to wildwestextra.com and click the yellow icon that looks like a coffee cup. All right, thank you so much for joining me, and a big thank you to Radu Alexander for helping to research and write today's episode. I'll be back soon with more true tales from the wild and woolly West. Until then, don't go making up any fraudulent land grants, okay? Don't start selling fake treasure maps, and whatever you do, don't let anyone take you into a remote wilderness area blindfolded like Dr. Thorne. Trust me, it will not end well. Best case scenario, you wake up with a sore butthole and a funny taste in your mouth. All right, till next week, adios.